I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Again, I'm so glad that you're joining me today. If you've been following Searching for Heroes for a while, you know that I've had the privilege of speaking with many incredible veterans, men and women who have survived unimaginable experiences in conflict zones and who often face immense challenges readjusting to civilian life after months, sometimes even after years in active combat. This struggle is especially profound for those who served in the Vietnam War. Unlike many returning veterans today, they came home to a country that wasn't always ready to welcome them back. Instead of gratitude, many were met with blame and hostility. Despite the fact that most didn't choose to go to Vietnam, they were drafted. I bring this up because just last Wednesday, April the 30th, marked 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War. Anniversaries like this offer a moment for reflection and a chance to show long overdue respect to the veterans who served, regardless of how we may feel about the war itself. That brings me to today's guest, U.S. Navy veteran Jim Dickson. Jim served as an Operations Intelligence Division officer aboard the USS Ticonderoga during the Vietnam War. He shares what it was like to serve during that time and how those experiences inspired his work with the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association. Last year, Jim led the creation of a powerful documentary titled Truths and Myths About the Vietnam War, which contrasts the public's perception of the war with the reality that he and his fellow veterans lived. I hope you enjoy this meaningful conversation with Jim. And look, if you know a Vietnam veteran, I encourage you to reach out and thank them today.
I joined the Navy in 1967. I went to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Naval War College is located. It was not easy to get into. I've learned in years later that they only accepted maybe one out of every 24 people that applied. So it was, my roommate was a graduate of Yale. It was a lot of very capable people. And the last few weeks I was there, I did volunteer for swift boats. I think my class maybe had 150. Six of us volunteered. They picked two. I didn't get picked, so I was assigned to be on an aircraft carrier, the USS Ticonderoga CVA-14. It was an attack carrier that operated on Yankee Station, located off the coast of Vietnam, where there were always three aircraft carriers that conducted about half the bombing of North Vietnam and other things. And I was the division officer, the Operations Intelligence Division officer for about 60 men that worked in what's known as Combat Information Center, CIC, which is the operations center of most Navy ships, and then later went up to the bridge and later qualified as officer of the deck underway, which is a responsible job because when you have that role, you only report to the captain and you're the guy who in charge regardless of rank. And I made two deployments, 1968, January to August, and essentially the same thing next year, 1969.
Yeah. Well, what kind of person would you say you were before the war? And then how do you think that the war and being there changed you in any way?
Well, let me just say, as far as the personal thing goes, that first deployment, I didn't know what I was doing. I was an ensign. I didn't know what I was doing, but by the end of the cruise, I did. And I don't mind saying this. I feel like that during that first deployment, I grew up. I had more experiences and things that, carried me for the rest of my life. Those two deployments, those are experiences that, you just don't ever forget. I think it's fair to say that most people that served in the Vietnam War always remember and vividly remember what they experienced and did, regardless of what it was.
Is there then like a particular moment or particular day from your time in Vietnam that really stands out to you, perhaps stands out as unforgettable? And what?
Well, I guess the first one that had impact on me is early in our first deployment. We had an A4 pilot, who was damaged and was trying to get back to the carrier. He didn't make it. He had to eject, and he ended up being in the ocean. And before he could be rescued, he died. He was drowned. He got tied up in the parachute shrouds and drowned. And I guess that was the first time that it really had sort of an impact.
So many people talked about Vietnam, about some of the terrible things that happened. But one of the parts in your film, Truths and Myths of the Vietnam War, you talk about the unprecedented humanitarian acts that actually happened out there. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that, about some of the unexpected humanity, the kindness that you actually remember.
Well, that's one of the things that we thought was important to bring out. And the best one to do it was Medal of Honor recipient, Major General retired Patrick H. Brady, a magnificent person. He was a medevac rescue helicopter pilot. They called him Dust Off. That was their call sign. And that caught hold, and that's what they were called. He made extraordinary rescues. He landed minefields, go up the sides of mountain in the fog sideways, just clearing so he could follow the tree line to the top to rescue somebody. He rescued an extraordinary number of people, but one of the things that he felt strongly about was all the humanitarian acts that were done. They'd rescue anybody, North Vietnamese, civilians, anybody that needed help. And there were a tremendous number of things that were done by our soldiers during the war, building schools and roads and bridges and churches, just more than any other war in history. And as he pointed out, that was our great victory during the war, and it's one of the unsung stories of what went on during the war. You never hear much about it.
And I suppose one of the questions is why? What changed? And again, in the film, you talk. It is talked about how the media, in some sense, went against what was happening out there. How the American Communist Party, backed by the Soviets, was turning the story. Like there seem to be so many people who are actually turning this story around. What do you?
Well, I think let me say that I think it's fair to say that one of the big problems we have in our country and the journalistic community, and in particular, is the lack of intellectual honesty, and many believe it actually began during the Vietnam War. For example, we gave that perfect example of Walter Cronkite, who was, back in that day, there were 3 evening news shows, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Well, he was CBS, probably as respected as anyone. And he goes to Vietnam during the Tet Offensive on February 13th and reports in an untranscribed report that it went, that he reported that the Tet Offensive was a great victory for South Vietnam and the U.S. forces and so forth. He comes back, and on February 27th, at the end of his broadcast, reads this report written by his producer, allegedly, that stated the direct opposite, that there was a quagmire, we're going nowhere, and so on and so forth. His producer, I understand, later wrote in his autobiography that it was that comments was inspired by God. I mean, in other words, we have both in the film to see. You can see what he reported from Vietnam, and 13 days later reports the direct opposite.
That's right. And what he says when he goes back to the U.S., he says it is clear this is a stalemate.
Right.
But again, you say, and you make quite clear in the film that it wasn't really a stalemate, that the U.S. was making progress on the ground. And this idea that the war was unwinnable is also really questioned and put to the test.
That's one of the things. See, that's a perfect example, but we have many others, in there. One example is there was congressional testimony in the Fulbright hearings in November of 1971. And here's John Kerry. Was a Vietnam veteran, and he was in charge of what's known as Vietnam Veterans Against the War. It was only about 2,500 veterans, a small group, but very effective with the press. And he testifies before this committee about all these atrocities that they had a confab up in Detroit about 6 weeks prior, where they had all these Vietnam veterans who reported about all these atrocities that went on, raping people and ransacking villages in the fashion of Genghis Khan and tying testicles to electric wires and all this. Well, the truth is, as Bob Turner, prominent historian and a Vietnam vet and a distinguished fellow at the University of Law at the University of Virginia, pointed out that all these people up there in that confab, most of them had never even been to Vietnam. And one guy went from Baltimore with Kerry up there to Detroit. And when he got up there, Kerry threatened if he didn't sign this document that all these atrocities would on, way he wasn't going to get him a ride home. I mean, and then he goes and testifies to all these things. Well, what happened is 30 years later, Kerry's on Meet the Press, and he's now thinking about running for president. So they asked him about it, and his comment was, well, those were words of an angry young man, and that he wanted Americans to know that the soldiers served very honorably. In other words, he retracted his own statements, but the damage was done back then.
Yeah. And it was the finger is also pointed somewhat at politicians. There's a clip in the film from Ronald Reagan who said, looking back at it, he says, they were not defeated. They were denied permission to win.
Well, I believe that that's how the vast majority of Vietnam veterans that are still living feel today. And that's why this film resonates with them, because it acknowledges that position. And a lot of us have felt this way for years.
Can you give us an example, perhaps, of how maybe the politicians sort of denied the permission?
Well, I think the most important thing is we signed the Paris Peace Treaty in January of 73, and then we reneged on our agreements. I mean, our word wasn't worth the paper it was written on, because we had agreed to sustain support to the South Vietnamese government at the same level it had been providing. And if we'd have continued that, it would have, I think the outcome would have been different. I mean, right there is one example of it. I think that's one of the lessons to be learned from it. The other lesson is we don't want to fight a war unless we intend to win it. I think that's the bottom line.
We'll be back in a moment with Searching for Heroes. I wonder, as a slight aside, if you felt the same way about Afghanistan. Do you think that was entering a war without the will to win it?
Well, we certainly didn't end it with anything like that. And the way it ended is, I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of veterans are very critical of how that was done. It could have been handled a lot better, and at least had a better level of success. I do think that it would have been better to beginning to think through what is our long-term plan here. And I think even then it would have been good to do that. But certainly the way it ended was, of course, very, very sad.
The film also looks quite closely at the treatment of returning vets back to the US, how badly they were treated. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own experience. Did you feel that America was a different country when you went back?
Well, when I came back, I was able to wear civilian clothes, so I really didn't directly encounter the things that a lot of people did, because all we did is ask some of our members, and those 4 people that were in the film, they were our members, went down to the History Center, where we have a close relationship, and were filmed about what happened to them. And I think they're fairly typical what went on. Now, for example, I don't think it was typical that people were spit on, but there were a number of people where that did happen, and it's well documented in a book that was written about what happened to about 400 servicemen that were documented, and I think 80 of them were actually spit on. So it wasn't common, but it did happen, and so there was this feeling. It was really odd that you didn't have any sense of pride like people did coming home from World War II. And we, of course, were children of that war. So we had some sense of patriotism for that reason. But it wasn't anything like that that went on. It was only years later people were starting to wake up to the fact that how poorly we were treated. And I think the film we have gave good examples of the mistreatment.
Yeah, no, it really did. When you came back, did you feel some sort of emotional weight of what you'd experienced as well? You know, some people said that many, particularly soldiers, you know, they weren't what we would call PTSD today. Maybe in that case, you know, back in the Vietnam era, that wasn't really addressed as much, and perhaps it was harder for some people, some soldiers, to come
Well,
back into normal
yeah,
life.
and that's a valid point. We we wanted to originally do the film like 35 minutes because of the attention span of people today. We took it up to about 46 minutes, and we did the best we could. And we tried to cover what we thought were the key points, but maybe we were a little light on that. We just couldn't cover everything, but that certainly is a major factor today. And our organization does a lot of things to try to support efforts to and improve treatment of veterans, which our country's been a little bit light on over the years.
Can you tell me a little bit about your organization, the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Association, and perhaps, first of all, tell me a little bit about them, but then also talk about the support you are giving to veterans at the
Well,
moment.
our group was founded in 1982 to promote patriotism and honor the people that gave up their lives in the Vietnam War and to promote a positive image of the Vietnam veterans, because a lot of people back then maybe didn't have a positive image. And so, I could, if you allow me, I'd just like to give you some examples. We have monthly luncheons, for example, and the number of speakers we've had is over the years is extremely impressive. I mean, we'd have U.S. senators, governors, a lot of notables. One day we had the secretary who typed up the D-Day orders for Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. We had at one luncheon in I think it was 2015. At that time, there were 78 living Medal of Honor recipients. We had 10 of them at one of our luncheons. We have established a court mentor program where there's pro bono legal advice given to veterans. We have a veteran scholarship program with arrangements with most of the universities in Georgia, University of North Georgia, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Georgia State University, Chattahoochee Technical College, Gwinnett Technical College. Then 100 cents of every dollar donated to that scholarship goes to the recipients. Not one penny is taken for administrative costs. We have two books that we published called I Want to Talk and I Want to Talk Too, where we all wrote articles about our experiences and what we did during the war. And just last week, because of Black Friday, the ending of the Vietnam War, April 29th, we had a commemoration ceremony, and Al Lippert, who is the commander-in-chief of the VFW, was the keynote speaker. Recently, we were up in Washington, D.C. for the National Vietnam Veterans Day and went to the ceremony there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where Doug Collins, who's Secretary of Veterans Affairs, was the speaker. And the day before, we were at Arlington National Cemetery. And that evening, we had a dinner with Lieutenant General Mick Kicklighter, who was picked by President Bush to be in charge of the 50th anniversary of the ending of the World War II, and later served as director for many years of the Vietnam War Commemoration Office. And during this dinner, he stated that we have one of the most effective veteran organizations in the country. And he did state that he saw the film 3 times and thought we ought to get an Oscar.
Do you think you've had a big impact then on how sort of Vietnam, how the war, how Vietnam veterans are seen today? Have you seen a real shift, not just among veterans, but among, the normal person?
Yes, there has been a huge shift. And we now have respect. For example, this film is going to be shown this year at the National Convention for the VFW in Columbus, Ohio in early August, and later in August, it'll be shown again in Tampa at the American Legion National Convention. They would just send out some information about the film to the website for the West Point Alumni Association. The film, the University of North Georgia has today more U.S. Army cadets than any other institution today, with the exception of West Point. And they show this film of ours every semester to their military history classes up there. And it's something we're very proud of. We consider the film to be our enduring legacy for future generations.
I know that the film sends quite a few messages about Vietnam, but what do you wish people today understood about the Vietnam War and the people who served in it?
Well, that one of the things that comes out in the film, that it was for a noble purpose. For example, the domino theory espoused by President Eisenhower originally in 1954, where if one country falls to communism, another country nearby will fall. And as Mark Morier, the historian in our film, points out and documents very clearly and substantiate in his second book, Triumph Regained, that covers the Vietnam War 65 to 68. If we had not gotten involved in 65 actively as we did, Indonesia would have definitely fallen to communism, no question about it. And if that would have happened, then Malaysia probably is right behind it, including Singapore. Then you have Thailand, you have Philippines, and all those other countries are explained and documented in his book, although they weren't, mentioned in the film. One thing people ought to remember, that after the fall of Saigon in 75, in the next 10 years, there were more than 3.5 million people killed. There were more in the next 10 years, an extraordinary number of people that rivals what the Holocaust and World War II. A lot of people don't even know this.
We talk often about resilience on this podcast as well. And I just wonder, you must have seen some incredible resilience out there amongst other soldiers, amongst the people operating out there. Is that something that you remember as well? The strength of the soldiers as they were fighting, the strength of the people out there. Was it a resilient strength?
Well, keep in mind, I was on an aircraft carrier, and so I can speak. I think the best resilience were from the pilots, and the resilience that they had was, really something to. First of all, just to land and take off of an aircraft carrier alone just takes quite a something, and to run these missions that they ran, there were more. Hanoi was the most heavily defended area probably in the history of warfare. And what should have happened is we should have taken out those surface air missile sites while they were being constructed, not send in our pallets after they were built. And the end result was over half the F-105s that were ever built were shot down.
That's right. And some of those had USSR written on them, or they have Soviet written on them. I mean, you see the clips in your film.
Yeah. It's just, it's something that, that's a perfect example of why the war wasn't conducted, as pointed out in the film. The commander of the Pacific forces in the Pacific, Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, stated that it was the most asinine way to conduct a war imaginable. I mean, here's the man in charge of everything. And I think that reflects the feelings of a lot of people today. We've had it shown on Georgia Public Television a couple of times, South Carolina Public Television. It'll be on Alabama on Memorial Day. It's been on other television stations. Look, but I think it's fair to say all we are just a bunch of old peddlers trying to get people to learn our version of the war before we die.
Well, and I think
that's what we're trying. And we don't make any money on the film. You know how you get a little money if you get up to a certain number of views on YouTube? We have it blocked. We don't get 1 penny. We want to make sure we don't get 1 penny. And everybody who was in this film, including the actor Sam Elliott, no one was ever paid to be in the film.
Yeah. I think if people see the movie as well, see the film, they will understand why it is so important. Can I ask a sort of a broader question? We're talking about the resilience of the soldiers, this incredible generation of people who went out. Do you feel that the youth, even after that, you had the hippie generation, now that you have the youth today on the computers, do you think that the youth at the moment don't have the same strength, hard work ethic that perhaps they did a generation or two ago? Is there a weakness developing?
Well, I'd have to say we don't. We feel that there is in a broad sense, but fortunately our service today is a volunteer army, and we're reflecting a bias here that we have. I think Pete Hegseth has a warrior ethic, and I think the recruitment levels are coming up significantly because of the leadership of the current administration. So they were able to capture that, but there are also a lot of people that don't have any idea. I'll give you an example of how dominant we were out there in the South China Sea from my neck of the woods. Sometimes we would have to, because of traveling into the wind, to launch and recover planes, it would take longer than the time we could allocate to going downwind. And we try to be on the same position. But because of having to go 30 knots when there's no wind, we'd often move off station. And several times we got within the territorial limits of Hunan, which is part of China. We didn't care. We ruled the roost out there at the South China Sea. We were very strong. We had a very powerful Navy. Today, we don't have that. By comparison, we're working around with handcuff with, it's just not the same. There have been collisions there in that area and up at the Sea of Japan. Those kind of things, and it just didn't happen when we were there. So we do feel that there is a little slippage in that way. Maybe it's just a case of a bunch of old farts remembering their youth and trying to promote it unjustly. But a lot of us feel the sentiment that you just expressed.
Yeah. I think even after the war ended, Vietnam War ended, there was a sort of effect on the military, that the military in general was seen in a negative way for quite a few years in the US.
Absolutely.
How hurtful that it must have been to you, to everyone who served there, who lost people out there. Like that must have really hurt when you came back and you saw people who hadn't been out there feeling this way for all the work you did.
Yeah, well, see, after I got back to the East Coast after that, I didn't want to have a career in the military. I wanted to go to graduate school for business. And so I had a chance to get out a little early. So I just went ahead and did it. I didn't have a lot of confidence in things. It wasn't the same feeling that people would have had during World War II, for example. The climate was, back then, everyone wanted to serve, and of course, we knew that generation firsthand because of our, we were the babies of that World War II, so we knew about it and grew up with that and thought differently. A lot of us thought, you ought to serve, and that's how you thought. There was a sense of patriotism that a lot of us just grew up with.
And I wonder, just to finish up, if you could tell us what as you look back, you've made this film. This is such an incredible piece of work, and it's educating so many people. But when you look back at the war, how do you see it? How do you remember it?
Well, I remember it as I say, where people served for a noble purpose, but we had leadership that was flawed. And that there were many ways that this worked in different times and things that could have been done to cause us to win the war. And, that's how the film ends, with a quote by President Reagan that hopefully at this late hour we can all at least agree that we should never again send young men and women to fight and die in a war unless we're prepared to let them win. And that's how a lot of us feel.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. And just as we finish, can you let us know where can people go to watch the film?
We have it on our website. It doesn't cost anything. It's avvba.org. That's Apple, Victor, Bravo, Alpha.org. And you just go to that website, and right there on the home landing page is a link to the film.
Well, and I encourage everyone to go see it. I've watched it myself, and I just think it's important to look back. And more than ever, it's important to honor, respect, hold up those people who were out there and what they were doing, which has been forgotten by so many. Well,
thank you so much, Ben, for giving us an opportunity to discuss the film and to honor Vietnam War veterans. And I think, I hope it's okay for me to say once again, all of us admire you immensely.
Yeah, well, thank you, sir. I admire you as well.
Well, hope you have a wonderful day.
And you too.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope people go out and watch it. I mean, I watched it earlier on, and I just know that it will change minds when people sit and watch it. And I think that's so important.
Well, thank you again, Ben.
All right. Take care, Jim. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.